On that clear November day in 1961, the crew of the Greek cargo ship Theo was on a routine voyage in the waters of the Bahamas when Second Officer Nikolaos Spakidakis spotted something unusual through his binoculars. Floating in the vast ocean, surrounded by endless blue, was a tiny raft. What the crew saw as they approached made even the most experienced sailors hold their breath. On a small cork raft lay a blonde girl, barely clinging to life. Her skin was burned and blistered by the scorching sun. Her lips were chapped from thirst, and her body temperature had risen to a dangerous 40.5 degrees Celsius. But she was still breathing. 11-year-old Terri Duperrault had spent nearly 4 days alone on the open sea, without food or water, witnessing and being a victim of one of the most shocking crimes of the time. One of the crew members managed to photograph this moment, a tiny figure floating in the vastness of the ocean. An image that would soon make headlines in newspapers around the world. It all started like an ordinary family trip. Dr. Arthur Duperrault, a successful ophthalmologist from Green Bay, Wisconsin, had long dreamed of showing his family the beauty of the Bahamas, together with his 38-year-old wife Jean and their 3 children, 14-year-old Brian, 11-year-old Theo, and 7-year-old Renee. They had long saved up for this trip. Finally, they rented a luxurious 18-meter yacht called Bluebell. The ship's captain was Julian Havel, a 44-year-old war veteran who seemed to be the perfect man for the job. He was accompanied by his new wife, Meriden, whom he had married just 4 months earlier. The first few days of the trip felt like a dream. The family enjoyed snorkeling near Gretabaco Island and collecting colorful shells on white sand beaches. Dr. Duperrault even told a local commissioner of his plans to return for Christmas. No one could have suspected that behind Captain Harvey's friendly smile there was a monster. He had already been married 5 times, and each of his wives had died under mysterious circumstances. His yachts and boats, always insured for large sums, had a strange tendency to sink, while Harvey himself miraculously survived each time and collected the insurance money. On the evening of November 12th, little Terri went to bed early in her cabin. She had no idea that this small decision would save her life. In the middle of the night, she was awakened by the heart-rending cries of her brother. "Help, Daddy! Help!" Almost 50 years later, she recalled in an interview with Fox News, "It was the kind of scream that lets you know immediately that something terrible has happened." As it later turned out, Captain Harvey had chosen that night to carry out his gruesome plan. First, he killed his new wife Mary, whom he had only recently insured for a large sum of money. He planned to throw her body overboard and claim that she had accidentally fallen into the sea. However, Dr. Duperrault happened to witness the murder. When he tried to stop Harvey, the captain killed him too. The rest of the family rushed to the scene after hearing the commotion, and the killer could not leave any witnesses alive. When the terrified Terri climbed onto the deck, she saw a nightmare before her. Her mother and brother lying in pools of blood. 8W roughly pushed the girl back to her cabin, where she curled up on her bed in fear. Soon she sensed that something was wrong. The room was filling with water. Harvey had deliberately opened the ship's seacocks to sink the yacht and destroy all evidence of his crime. At the last moment, Harvey threw a rope from the lifeboat to the girl, but as Terri's friend Richard Logan later found out, was this not an act of mercy? When he saw the girl on deck, he realized, "My God, there's a chance she'll survive." "She had to be killed," Logan recounted. Harvey planned to kill the girl while she held onto the rope, but Terrio instinctively let go. In total darkness, fighting the waves and her own fear, she managed to unbuckle a small cork just before Bluebell disappeared into the waves. Dressed only in a light blouse and pink pants, she was now alone in the middle of the ocean. This was the beginning of her true struggle for survival. The first night was the most terrifying. The waves crashed over the tiny raft, soaking Terri to the bone. The salt water burned her skin, and the cold wind cut through her like a knife. She had no idea which way she was drifting and clung tightly to the almost weightless cork raft that was her only hope. As the sun rose, a new problem arose: thirst. There was water all around her, but she couldn't drink it. Her lips were coated with a salty crust and began to crack. She tried to moisten them, but the salt only made her thirst worse. By midday, the scorching sun had turned the raft into a burning pan. With no protection from the heat, she felt blisters forming on her skin. To escape the heat, she dangled her legs in the water every now and then. This helped her cool down, but every time she looked into the dark depths, she was gripped by terror as to what was lurking beneath the surface. At some point she saw a fin in the... She saw a shark glide close by, and her heart almost stopped. But it wasn't a shark. It was dolphins. They circled her raft for hours, as if protecting her. During the night, the temperature dropped sharply, and Harry began to shiver. To keep warm, she tried to move, but any sudden movement threatened to tip the fragile raft. She learned to carefully shift her weight and balance on the tiny surface. The stars above her were her only companions during those long, endless hours. By the end of the second day, the hunger became unbearable. Her stomach was cramping painfully. She saw small fish swimming by, but there was no way to catch them. Occasionally, she would spot floating creatures and wish there was something edible underneath, but they were always just out of her reach. On the third day, the hallucinations began. Her exhausted mind began to play cruel tricks on her. She thought she heard her parents' voices calling her name. Islands appeared in the distance, but when she tried to paddle to them, they vanished into thin air. At one point, she was convinced she saw a ship on the horizon and even tried to scream, but her parched throat would not produce a sound. Worst of all, however, were the moments when the sea was completely still, when the water surface was smooth and the sun turned the world into a scorching desert. Time seemed to stand still. There was no movement, no sound, just the endless blue stretching in all directions. Terri began to doubt whether the world beyond this watery prison even existed. 3 days before her rescue, Harvey had already been found in a lifeboat, along with the body of little Renee. He told the authorities a dramatic story about a sudden storm and a fire on board. He claimed he had tried heroically to save the passengers. He found the girl's body in the water and tried desperately to revive her. Everyone believed the brave captain, a war veteran with a supposedly impeccable reputation. When Terrio was finally lifted aboard the Theo, she was so weak she could no longer stand. Her skin was covered in blisters from severe sunburns. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her clothes had become stiff from the salt. Her body temperature had risen to a dangerous 40.5 degrees Celsius. Doctors later said that if she had been in the sea just a few hours longer, she would not have survived. Terrio spent a week in a Miami hospital recovering from severe dehydration and sunburns. It was only 7 days after her rescue that police were finally able to speak. to the brave girl, and the truth about that terrible night was finally revealed. Meanwhile, Harvey was staying in a Florida motel. When news of Terrio's survival reached the coast, he heard about it on the radio. The killer turned pale and stammered, "My God, this is just wonderful." The next day, he was found dead in his hotel bathroom. He had slit his own throat. The investigation revealed a shocking pattern of Javi's crimes. It turned out that he had narrowly escaped prosecution for the death of one of his previous wives in a car accident. His yachts and boats had a suspicious tendency to sink, which always resulted in large insurance payments. But this time, his plan had failed. He had not counted on the strength of a little girl. A memorial plaque was placed in memory of the Duperrault family in Fort Howard Memorial Park in Wisconsin. The inscription reads, "In memory of the family of Arthur Duperrault, who went missing near the Bahamas on November 12, 1961. They are forever in the hearts of their loved ones and rest with him who is eternal life. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God." For many years, Terri remained silent about the nightmare she had lived. It was only in the 1980s that she began to share her story with close friends. This led her to seek psychological support, and eventually to write the book, Alone, Orphanette on the Ocean, with Richard Logan. Almost 50 years later, during a book signing, something incredible happened. "Last month we were signing books," she recalled in an interview, "and some of my former teachers with whom I worked 49 years ago, to check on me. They told me they regretted not being able to talk to me or help me at the time. At the time, they were told to pretend nothing had happened. This experience changed their outlook on life forever. When you spend 4 days alone with the sea, you either break or you become stronger," she later said. "I learned to never be afraid," she says. "I was a child of nature and loved the water. I had a strong faith. I believed in God and prayed that He would help me. And I just went with the flow." Her story has become a symbol of the incredible strength of the human spirit and the will to survive. "I always believed I was saved for a reason," she says. "But it took me 50 years to find the strength to tell my story and give hope to others. And somewhere in the dark waters of the Bahamas, root blue balls still linger, as a silent witness to one of the most extraordinary stories of survival and the uncovering of a brutal crime in maritime history."